In the quiet hum of a Smithsonian lab, a single feather lies beneath the microscope. Fragile, silent, yet it holds the power to expose a killer. This is the world where birds keep the secrets, and one woman dares to make them speak. The air in coastal Maine that April evening carried a damp chill, the kind that clung to your clothes and made every shadow seem heavier. Bangor International Airport was quiet, its terminal nearly empty save for the tired travelers moving with that slow, after-dark rhythm. Among them was a small, silver-haired woman in her early 60s, stepping into the back seat of a detective's car. She was no ordinary passenger. Her name was Roxie Laybourne, and in the world of birds, she was a legend. At the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., her colleagues half-jokingly called her the feather detective. If a fragment of feather could be identified, Roxie could identify it. She had trained her eyes and mind to read their microscopic structures like a map, tracing each delicate barbule back to its avian source. On this night, however, her job wasn't to help an airport avoid another plane crash or to advise biologists on bird migration. She was here for something far darker, to help convict a man for murder. The drive south toward the small city of Belfast took about an hour. The moon was full but veiled in thin clouds, casting pale light across endless stretches of pine forest. Roxie, quiet by nature, sat in the back seat, her mind half on the case, half on the strange new world outside the window. She'd been told Belfast was the chicken capital of Maine. But it was only now, passing odd, low wooden buildings along the roadside, that she began to see what that meant. Brooder houses, the detective explained. The poultry industry dominated life here. Feathers drifted on the wind, clinging to trees, sidewalks, and the boots of passers-by. To most people, it was an unremarkable detail. To Roxie, it was unsettling. Feathers, the very evidence she'd been called to testify about, seemed to be everywhere. And that could make her work more complicated than she liked. Waiting for her at the hotel was a handwritten note from the prosecutor, a young but determined lawyer named Peter Cully. He apologized for not meeting her at the airport. The trial preparations had run late, but tomorrow he promised they would get to her testimony. Roxie was the penultimate witness, the second-to-last piece of his case against Henry Andrews, a laborer accused of killing 71-year-old Hazel Doak in her own farmhouse. The case was brutal in its simplicity. Hazel had been found dead in her bed, smothered with a pillow. But when the pillow burst under the assault, it released a cloud of white and tan feathers, some lodging in her hair, others in her mouth and nose, many scattering across the room and down the hall. Days later, when Andrews was arrested, police noted feathers stuck to his clothing. Those feathers were sent to Washington, and that's where Roxie came in. Her analysis was meticulous. Under her microscope, the feather fragments from Andrews's clothes matched the commercial duck, goose, and chicken mix inside the pillow from the crime scene. It was the first time in American history that feather evidence was being used in a homicide trial. If the jury believed her, it could mean conviction. But Belfast was a town where feathers were as common as dust. On the morning of her testimony, Roxie stepped outside for fresh air and spotted chicken feathers right there in the hotel parking lot. Later, on the drive to the courthouse, she passed flatbed trucks stacked with crates of live birds, feathers spiraling into the breeze behind them. For a scientist whose credibility rested on showing that the feathers on Andrews's clothes came from the murder scene, the ubiquity of stray poultry down was an uncomfortable complication. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. The wooden benches were filled with townsfolk and reporters. Roxie, unused to the rhythms of criminal trials, found herself making small talk with a man who said he was interested in birding, only to be quietly pulled aside and told he was Andrews's defense attorney. When her turn finally came, she walked to the stand with a calm, deliberate pace. The prosecutor guided her through the basics of her work, then asked her to explain what she'd found. She didn't overstate her conclusions. Instead, in her plain-spoken North Carolina drawl, she told the jury that, as far as she could tell, the feathers matched, and could have come from the same source. In the sterile quiet of the courtroom, her words carried weight. But the defense pushed back, framing feather forensics as an untested novelty, a weak basis for convicting a man of murder. They had another angle too, insanity. They painted Andrews as a troubled man with a long history of violent, erratic behavior, made worse by a traumatic head injury. Their argument wasn't that he hadn't killed Hazel Doak, but that if he had, he wasn't legally responsible for his actions. The jury deliberated for just 2.5 hours before returning with a verdict. Not guilty. For the prosecution, it was a stunning defeat. For Roxie, it was a sobering lesson in how science, no matter how carefully applied, could falter in the unpredictable theater of a courtroom. She left Maine with her dignity intact but her mind already turning to the next case. One that would take her far from the feather-littered streets of Belfast to the wide-open desert of Utah, where another murder awaited her attention. And as she boarded the plane home, she might have reflected on how strange it all was. That a woman who'd once spent her days quietly preparing bird specimens for museum drawers was now a player in the messy, dangerous world of violent crime. The road to that transformation had begun years earlier, with a very different kind of tragedy. One not in a farmhouse, but in the cold, dark waters of Boston Harbor. October 4th, 1960, began like any other autumn day in East Boston. The air was crisp, the harbor was calm, and the daily rhythm of the neighborhood played out as it always did. Kids pedaling bikes, dock workers hauling cargo, planes roaring in and out of Logan Airport. But by evening, the neighborhood would be bound forever to one of the most tragic aviation disasters in New England history. It was just before 5:40 p.m. when Eastern Airlines Flight 375, a Lockheed L-188 Electra bound for Philadelphia, Charlotte, and beyond, rolled down the runway. The weather was perfect. The plane, a sleek 4-engine turboprop, had been touted as one of the safest, fastest airliners in service. In the cabin, 72 people settled into their seats, likely thinking more about their destinations than the flight itself. Liftoff seemed smooth until it wasn't. Barely 150 feet off the ground, the nose of the plane pitched upward. Witnesses later described the left wing dipping sharply before the aircraft banked into a sudden, unnatural turn. In seconds, the Electra was almost vertical, then plummeting toward Boston Harbor. The impact tore the fuselage apart. Seats, luggage, and debris scattered across the water. Flames erupted briefly, then vanished in the spray. 62 lives ended in that instant. The survivors, just 10 of them, clung to wreckage until they were pulled to safety by nearby boaters. Within hours, speculation was running wild. Some witnesses swore they'd seen an engine explode midair. Others thought the pilot had overcorrected for a stall. But early the next morning, Federal Aviation Administration Chief Elwood Pete Quesada walked down the runway where the Electra had begun its doomed descent. There, scattered across the tarmac, were the mangled bodies of dozens of small birds. The discovery was unsettling. If these birds had been sucked into the plane's engines, could they have brought it down? And if so, what did that mean for every other aircraft sharing the skies with flocks of migrating birds? The idea that a bird could destroy a commercial airliner sounded absurd to the public. But pilots knew better. Bird strikes, the collision of a bird with an aircraft, were as old as flight itself. Quesada needed answers fast. A Harvard ornithologist on the scene identified the runway carcasses as European starlings, a species not native to North America but now widespread, and often considered a pest. The birds were small, each weighing just a few ounces, but if enough were sucked into multiple engines during takeoff, the results could be deadly. The press latched onto the starling theory immediately. Was it possible that a flock of such small birds had crippled 3 of the Electra's 4 engines at the most critical moment of flight? Investigators had to know for certain. That's when the Smithsonian entered the picture. At the National Museum of Natural History, senior ornithologist John Aldrich was approached for help. Could the mangled remains from the engines be positively identified? Aldrich turned to someone he trusted completely. A quiet, meticulous woman who had been working in the museum's taxidermy and specimen preparation rooms for more than 15 years. Roxie Laybourne. Roxie wasn't an academic in the traditional sense. She didn't have a PhD, and she'd never been sent on glamorous collecting expeditions like many of her male colleagues. But she had something far more valuable for this job: decades of hands-on experience with birds, from common backyard sparrows to rare tropical species. She knew feathers the way a fingerprint expert knows ridges and whorls. When Aldrich handed her the evidence, scraps of feather and tissue so badly mangled they barely looked avian, most people would have seen nothing more than unidentifiable fluff. But under Roxie's microscope, patterns emerged, tiny hooks and filaments, the microscopic structures called barbules. Each species' feathers were built just a little differently. Within days, Roxie confirmed the suspicion. The remains belonged to European starlings, and not just one or two birds. Judging from the quantity of feather fragments, investigators concluded that Flight 375 had flown into a massive flock, perhaps 20,000 birds, just seconds after takeoff. The combined weight and number of strikes crippled the engines almost instantly. The final accident report, released in 1962, called it a freak accident, the result of an unlikely convergence of bird behavior and flight path. But it also made something else clear. Bird strikes were a bigger problem than anyone had admitted. The FAA needed to know which species posed the greatest threats and how to keep them away from aircraft. For Roxie, this case was the start of something unexpected. The FAA gave her a microscope, a new set of responsibilities, and a steady stream of envelopes from airports around the country. Inside each package was the same grim calling card: Snarge, the bloody, greasy remains of birds struck by planes. Her task was to identify them piece by piece, feather by feather. It was painstaking, unglamorous work. But as she studied more and more samples, Roxie began to refine a method, a way to match even the tiniest fragment of a feather to the bird it had come from. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet, behind-the-scenes skill would one day move from the hangars of the aviation world into the most unexpected of arenas, the witness stand of a murder trial. And when that day came, science, crime, and justice would collide, with Roxie in the middle. Long before she stood in courtrooms or pored over microscopic feather fragments from plane engines, Roxie Laybourne was a quiet girl in rural North Carolina with an eye for detail and a patience that set her apart. She was born in 1910 when the Wright brothers' flights were still fresh news, and the idea of a woman working in science, let alone becoming a national expert, was almost unheard of in her part of the South. Her family wasn't wealthy, but they were resourceful. The land provided much of what they needed, and in the countryside, self-reliance was a skill learned early. As a child, Roxie spent long hours outside, wandering through woods and fields, watching the way birds moved, how they seemed to vanish into the trees when danger passed overhead. She didn't just see birds. She studied them. She noticed the sheen on a blackbird's wing, the subtle speckles on a sparrow's breast, the way feathers changed color in different light. She was also fascinated by how things were made and preserved. In an era before television or internet, curiosity had to be satisfied by books, observation, and the occasional mentor willing to share a skill. When she was a teenager, she met a local taxidermist who showed her how to skin and preserve a bird specimen. It was a delicate, almost surgical process, removing the internal parts while keeping the feathers and outer form intact. One slip and a tear in the skin could ruin the whole mount. Roxie took to the work instinctively. She had no fear of the messier parts of the job. More than that, she had a perfectionist's touch. She learned to stitch tiny seams so clean they were invisible, to fluff and smooth feathers until they lay exactly as they had in life. Taxidermy wasn't just craft, it was an act of respect, a way of honoring the animal while preserving it for study. After high school, she pursued her interest in biology, attending Meredith College in Raleigh. It wasn't the typical path for a woman in the 1920s, and there were times when the odds seemed stacked against her. Scientific careers for women were rare. Those that did exist often came with limited recognition and lower pay. But Roxie had no intention of settling for a job she didn't care about. She began working at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, where she handled everything from exhibit preparation to specimen care. The job was not glamorous. Dusty workrooms, the smell of preservatives, endless hours cleaning and cataloging. But each task added to her growing expertise. She learned that the smallest detail, a misaligned feather, a mislabeled species, could distort scientific records. Accuracy mattered. Her skill did not go unnoticed. In the mid-1940s, she was offered a position at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., in the Division of Birds. It was a male-dominated world, full of academic egos and competitive field collectors, but Roxie didn't ruffle easily. She wasn't there for prestige or field glory. She was there to work. The Smithsonian's bird collection was vast, with specimens from every corner of the world. Roxie became one of its most dependable preparators, creating study skins, research-quality specimens stripped of internal organs but preserved with their plumage pristine, lying flat for long-term storage. These skins were the lifeblood of ornithology, the physical record that allowed scientists to study changes in species over decades and even centuries. For years, Roxie toiled in the background, producing thousands of specimens while her male colleagues traveled the world collecting them. She was meticulous, methodical, and unflappable, qualities that would later serve her well when she stepped into the high-pressure world of forensic science. Still, the idea that her skills could be used to solve crimes or investigate disasters was far from her mind. Her world was one of controlled conditions and quiet museum corridors, until the day her supervisor, John Aldrich, placed a mangled bundle of feathers and tissue on her desk and told her it had come from the wreckage of a crashed airliner in Boston Harbor. That moment, when she looked into the microscope and realized she could identify the bird species from almost nothing, would change her life. It was the spark that would eventually connect her to aviation safety, to law enforcement, and to the strange, winding path that would lead her into a Maine courtroom in 1972. But before that transformation, Roxie would spend the 1960s quietly pioneering a new field from scratch, building the foundation for feather forensics without any manual, blueprint, or mentor to guide her. And in doing so, she was about to step into a role no one else in the world could fill. The years after the Boston Harbor crash pulled Roxie Laybourne into an entirely new kind of work, one that would make her desk at the Smithsonian a clearinghouse for some of the strangest, grimmest mail in Washington, D.C. The Federal Aviation Administration, shaken by the realization that bird strikes could destroy a passenger jet, needed data, hard data. Which species were being hit most often? Where? How big were they? Without those answers, aircraft designers couldn't know how much bird-proofing was enough, and airport managers couldn't target the right species when they tried to keep birds away from runways. Roxie's orders were deceptively simple. Identify the species from every bird strike report sent in. In practice, it was like being asked to reconstruct an entire library from a handful of burned pages. Mechanics from airports and airlines were told to collect a feather or more from any bird that collided with a plane and mail it to the Smithsonian. What arrived on Roxie's desk was rarely anything as neat as a whole feather. Often it was just snarge, a foul-smelling slurry of blood, fat, and pulverized feather bits scraped from an engine intake or wing leading edge. Sometimes there was only a single fragment the size of a grain of rice. Under her microscope, however, those fragments became worlds of information. Each barbule, the microscopic branch-like structures coming off a feather's central shaft, had its own architecture. The arrangement, size, and pattern of these barbules varied subtly from species to species. No one had ever tried to build a systematic identification method based solely on them. Roxie began cataloging the structures she saw, cross-referencing them with the Smithsonian's vast collection of bird specimens. A horned lark's winter plumage looked different from its summer feathers. The down from a juvenile gull was nothing like an adult's flight feathers. Piece by piece, she built a mental and photographic reference library. The work was tedious, often solitary. Many of her male colleagues in the museum's upper ranks dismissed it as applied science of the most trivial kind, hardly worthy of the Smithsonian's prestige. But Roxie understood something they didn't. Every identification was a data point in a growing picture of aviation safety. By the mid-1960s, she had identified bird strikes involving everything from tiny warblers to hefty Canada geese. The reports revealed patterns, seasonal migrations, hotspots around certain airports, species that lingered near runways year-round. This information began shaping FAA policy, changing mowing schedules to discourage certain ground-feeding birds, modifying water drainage to make airfields less attractive to waterfowl, even altering flight paths during peak migration. Then came the first hints that her expertise might be useful beyond aviation. A few law enforcement officers heard about the woman at the Smithsonian who could ID a bird from a single feather. At first, the requests were minor: a poaching case involving illegal sale of protected bird species, a customs investigation over exotic plumage. Roxie treated them as interesting diversions from the endless stacks of snarge. But these side projects carried a different weight. In aviation, her work helped prevent accidents. In law enforcement, her identifications could mean fines, prison sentences, or freedom. The stakes were personal. Still, the leap from bird strikes to homicide cases was unimaginable. Until 1970, when a detective in Utah called about a brutal killing involving a torn-down jacket. The suspect's coat had ripped during the attack, scattering feathers around the scene. Could she match them? She could. And she did. That Utah case planted a seed. Feathers weren't just aviation hazards or decorative contraband. They were trace evidence, like fibers or fingerprints. If she could identify the species, she could sometimes link an object, a coat, a pillow, a blanket, directly to a crime. 2 years later, that seed would grow into the high-profile case that put her in the main courtroom against Henry Andrews. It was the first time feather forensics had been used in a homicide trial, and though the verdict disappointed prosecutors, it proved something vital. Feather evidence could survive the crucible of court testimony. From then on, Roxie's career would straddle two worlds: the quiet, meticulous science of the museum and the messy, high-stakes drama of criminal investigations. And as her reputation spread, so did the demands on her time. Cases would arrive from across the country: smuggling busts, wildlife crimes, suspected murders. The woman who had once spent her days preparing bird skins for research collections was becoming something else entirely: a forensic scientist in a field she had invented, standing alone at the intersection of ornithology and law. By the mid-1970s, word about the feather lady at the Smithsonian had spread far beyond the halls of aviation safety. Detectives who would never have dreamed of consulting an ornithologist were now dialing a DC museum to ask for help. At first, the requests were modest: a handful of small-town wildlife cases. A bald eagle feather found in a suspect's truck in Montana. A shipment of exotic parrot plumes intercepted at a New York dock. Under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, certain feathers were protected by federal law, and possession without a permit could mean hefty fines or jail time. Roxie's identifications provided the hard evidence needed to prosecute. But soon the calls shifted in tone. This wasn't just about poaching anymore. Detectives began asking about feathers found at violent crime scenes. A down comforter torn during a struggle. Pillow stuffing clinging to a victim's hair. Bits of fluff trapped in the cuff of a suspect's pants. In each case, the same question echoed. Could she tell if these feathers matched an object tied to the crime? Roxie could never promise certainty. Feathers, unlike fingerprints or DNA, rarely offered a 1 in a billion match. But she could narrow the possibilities dramatically. If a victim's wounds were packed with goose down and the only pillow in the house was filled with synthetic fiber, something didn't add up. If a suspect's jacket carried bits of snowy owl plumage, and the murder scene was littered with the same, the connection became hard to ignore. This new frontier thrilled her, but it also came with friction. Within the Smithsonian, some colleagues frowned at her growing entanglement with law enforcement. The institution prided itself on pure research and public education. Criminal cases were seen as grubby, sensationalist distractions. A few bureaucrats quietly questioned whether feather evidence was even real science, or if Roxie was lending the Smithsonian's name to a sideshow. She ignored the sniping. She knew her work was rigorous, every identification grounded in comparative analysis with the museum's collection, every conclusion hedged with the caution science demanded. But she also knew that in a courtroom, the atmosphere was different. Lawyers wanted certainty. Jurors wanted clear, confident answers. This tension was constant. In the lab, Roxie could spend hours under the microscope, tracing the architecture of a feather's barbules until she was satisfied. In court, she had minutes to translate that visual complexity into plain language without losing the jury's attention. She had to walk a fine line, never overstating her findings, but never letting her testimony be dismissed as trivial. One of her early murder cases after the Andrews trial came from the high desert of the Southwest. The victim had been bludgeoned in her home, and the suspect wore a torn-down jacket. The scene was littered with tiny clumps of insulating feathers, so degraded they looked like lint. Under Roxie's microscope, the verdict was clear. They matched the species mix from the suspect's jacket, a commercially sold goose down blend. That evidence helped secure a conviction. By now, police across the country knew. If a case involved feathers, there was only one person to call. And Roxie, who had spent decades in the museum's back rooms with little recognition, found herself fielding calls from homicide detectives, wildlife agents, and even FBI agents. Her quiet world was gone. The cases didn't stop, and neither did the pushback from some Smithsonian peers. But Roxie had discovered something intoxicating. A sense that her skill wasn't just preserving the past in dusty drawers, but actively shaping the present, sometimes tipping the scales toward justice. And justice, she was learning, was rarely neat. Every case brought new challenges. Feathers that were degraded beyond easy recognition, defense attorneys determined to paint her as a pseudoscientist, and the ever-present question. Could she stand up under the glare of cross-examination? She could, and she would. But her greatest tests were yet to come, high-profile cases that would take her far from the Smithsonian's quiet halls into the chaos of crime scenes, the heat of contested trials, and the scrutiny of a public fascinated by the idea that a single feather could change the outcome of a case. The call came in on a gray, windless morning. Roxie was in her Smithsonian workroom, a small, cluttered space where the hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the faint, ever-present smell of preservatives and specimen drawers. A detective from the Midwest was on the line. His voice was clipped, urgent. There had been a murder, a brutal one. The victim, a young woman, had been found in her apartment, bludgeoned and left on the living room floor. Among the usual crimes seen debris, blood, broken glass, scuffed carpet. Investigators had noticed something odd. Tiny white wisps caught in the folds of the woman's sweater and in the corners of the room. They looked like lint. But the lead crime scene tech suspected otherwise. To his eye, they seemed softer, more organic. He sent them to Roxie overnight. When she opened the envelope the next day, the samples were exactly what she had expected. Degraded, filthy, almost shapeless. Years of doing this work had taught her that feathers in a criminal context rarely arrived in tidy condition. These were no exception. They had been trampled, torn, and ground into the carpet fibers during the attack. Under her microscope, however, their identity emerged. The barbules were smooth, unpigmented, and faintly curved. A classic profile for goose down. She compared the microstructure against dozens of known samples from the Smithsonian's collection. The match was consistent. Commercial goose down of a type commonly used in winter jackets and bedding. But that was only the start. The detective told her they had a suspect. A man in his 30s with a long record of violent offenses. When police arrested him, he'd been wearing a down-filled parka, ripped in several places, its stuffing peeking out in tufts. The jacket, still in evidence, was sent to Roxie. She examined the parka's filling under the microscope and confirmed it. The barbules were identical to those from the crime scene. Same species mix, same structure, same wear pattern. In court, the prosecution used Roxie's testimony to weave a simple, powerful narrative. The attack had been so violent that the suspect's own jacket had torn, scattering goose down into the air, where it clung to the victim and settled around the apartment. The defense tried to undermine her. They implied the feathers could have come from anywhere. A couch cushion, a comforter, a stray pillow. Roxie stayed calm. She explained that the feather fragments were consistent with the mix in the suspect's jacket, and that their distribution at the scene matched the nature of the assault. Could the same feathers have come from another object? Possibly. But was it likely, given the circumstances? Her answer was clear. No. The jury believed her. The suspect was convicted. For Roxie, this case underscored what she already knew. In the right conditions, feathers could tell a story as vividly as blood spatter or fingerprints. They weren't magic bullets. They were puzzle pieces. But in skilled hands, they could help complete the picture of a crime. Word of her role spread again. This time, not just among wildlife agents and niche forensic circles, but among homicide detectives who began to wonder whether their own unsolved cases might benefit from her microscope. She was no longer simply a Smithsonian taxidermist with an unusual skill. She was becoming something rare, an independent expert whose testimony could bridge the gap between the natural world and the machinery of justice. But with each case, the stakes climbed higher. Soon, she would be drawn into an investigation so large, so public, and so politically charged that even she wondered if her work could survive the pressure. It was late summer when the FBI called. Not a regional field office, not a wildlife agent passing along a favor, but the Bureau itself from Washington. The case, they said, was sensitive, high profile, the kind of investigation that drew television crews and packed federal courtrooms. A series of armed robberies across multiple states had escalated into a deadly confrontation. In the latest incident, a store clerk had been shot and killed. The suspects fled, abandoning a getaway car in a wooded area near the state line. Inside the vehicle, agents found the usual forensic gold: fingerprints, a half-smoked cigarette, a crumpled ski mask. But there was something else. On the driver's seat, entangled in the fabric of the ski mask's interior, were wispy strands of what looked like pale gray lint. At first, the evidence text dismissed it as debris, the kind that rides in unnoticed on clothing. But one tech, recalling a briefing from years back about the feather lady at the Smithsonian, decided to take no chances. When the envelope arrived on Roxie's desk, she could see right away that this wasn't just dust. The texture was too fine, the filaments too structured. Under the microscope, the picture sharpened. They were feathers, or more precisely, feather fragments. She began her process. One sample from the ski mask, one from the car seat, side-by-side comparison under high magnification. The barbules were tightly coiled, slightly pigmented, with a distinctive node spacing, a combination she recognized from her reference work. It was down from a mallard duck. Mallard down wasn't exotic, but it had forensic value. It was used in certain outdoor gear, and one manufacturer in particular was known for blending mallard with goose down in its winter products. That blend had a unique ratio, something she could measure. When the FBI sent her additional evidence, a ripped-down vest recovered from a suspect's apartment, the pieces fell into place. The vest's filling matched the blend from the ski mask and the car seat almost perfectly. The agents were intrigued. Feather evidence wasn't something they'd ever presented in a federal murder trial. Could it hold up? Roxie gave them the same answer she gave every investigator. She could not say the feathers absolutely came from the suspect's vest, only that the microscopic structures were consistent with it, and that the blend matched known manufacturing patterns. In forensic science, absolute certainty was a dangerous claim. In court, the prosecution used her testimony to knit together their circumstantial case: fingerprints, ballistics, eyewitness accounts, with the physical link of the vest. The defense pounced, questioning whether mallard down could be found in countless other jackets and sleeping bags. Roxie stood firm. "It's possible," she said, "but the combination of species and blend ratio narrows the field considerably." It was enough. The jury convicted. Afterward, an FBI agent pulled her aside. "You know," he said, "when we sent you that envelope, some of the guys thought it was a waste of time." For Roxie, it was another step deeper into the realm of criminal forensics, a place she had never intended to go, yet where she now seemed indispensable. And with each new case, her standing grew, not just as a scientific oddity, but as a pioneer in a forensic discipline no one else in the world could practice with her level of precision. Still, she was careful to remind herself and others of the limits. Feathers could point, suggest, connect. They could hint at the truth, but they could not, by themselves, lock the truth in place. The next case, however, would come dangerously close to doing just that. A murder so strange, so chilling, that a single feather became the pivot on which the verdict turned. It began with a phone call from a sheriff's office in the rural Midwest, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's routines, and anything out of place set tongues wagging. The sheriff's voice was grim. A woman had been found dead in her farmhouse. No signs of forced entry, no weapon. The cause of death: smothering. She had been discovered in her bed, the covers pulled up neatly as though she'd simply gone to sleep. But there was something about the scene that didn't fit. White fragments, small, delicate, and soft, clung to her nightgown, her hair, and the pillow beneath her head. On the floor, near the bed frame, a few more were scattered. The deputies thought they were bits of lint or maybe fabric fibers. The sheriff wasn't so sure. A local crime lab technician confirmed they were feathers. That's when the sheriff thought of a news article he'd read about the Smithsonian feather lady, who had testified in a murder trial out east. When the package arrived in Washington, Roxie approached it as she did every case, methodically. She separated the samples. Feathers from the pillow, from the victim's hair, from the floor. Each was degraded, some twisted and broken from the pressure of the smothering. Under her microscope, the picture became clear. They were a commercial blend, mostly goose down with smaller amounts of duck and chicken feathers. The pattern was consistent with the fill used in mass-produced pillows in the 1960s and 70s. But that wasn't the breakthrough. The real moment came when the sheriff's office sent a second package. Clothing seized from a suspect, a farmhand who had been working on the property. His flannel shirt and denim pants had tiny, almost invisible white flecks embedded in the fibers. When Roxie examined those flecks, she saw the same barbule structures, the same species mix, the same commercial manufacturing traits as the feathers from the pillow. In court, the prosecutor built the case carefully. The defendant had been seen near the farmhouse on the night of the murder. His fingerprints were on the back door. And then there was the feather evidence, subtle, almost invisible, yet damning when paired with the rest. The defense did what they always did, attacked the novelty of the science. How could anyone be sure these feathers didn't come from somewhere else? After all, the region was full of poultry farms, and feathers were everywhere in the air. Roxie stayed steady. She didn't claim the feathers proved the man was the killer. What she said was this: the match in species mix, structure, and condition was consistent with the pillow from the crime scene, and finding those same traces embedded in his clothing was consistent with close contact during the incident. Her plain-spoken delivery, her refusal to overstate, worked in her favor. The jury listened. When the verdict came back, guilty, the sheriff called her personally to say thank you. It was the first time in the county's history that feather evidence had been presented in court, and it had played a key role in convincing the jury. For Roxie, it was another reminder that her work, while rooted in the quiet precision of a microscope, could reach far beyond the lab. Feathers were fleeting, fragile things. They could drift away on a breath of air. But in the right circumstances, they could also anchor the truth. The case added to her growing legend, but it also drew more attention than she liked. Reporters began calling the Smithsonian for interviews. Some colleagues resented the publicity, muttering that she was turning the museum into a crime lab. Others, though, saw the significance. Roxie had opened a door to a forensic tool no one else in the world had truly mastered. That door would soon swing wide for a case that would put her skills under a microscope in a whole new way. Not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. The call came not from a small-town sheriff this time, but from a state police headquarters bracing under the glare of national attention. A young woman had been found murdered in the guest house of a prominent political family's estate. The victim, a graduate student and part-time caretaker for the property, had been last seen locking up the main house after an evening reception. By morning, she was dead. The media swarmed the scene. Helicopters circled overhead. Satellite vans clogged the narrow drive. For the political family, known for its influence in state government, the stakes were immense. Any misstep in the investigation would be front-page news. Inside the guest house, the crime scene told a violent story. The victim had been struck repeatedly, then suffocated. On the carpet near her body, crime scene technicians found small, downy wisps clinging to drops of blood. More were lodged in her hair. At first glance, they looked like bits of insulation or stuffing. But one of the lead investigators, aware of the case in Maine where feather evidence had been used, decided to send samples to the Smithsonian. When Roxie opened the package, she immediately saw the complexity. These weren't the clean, uniform feathers of a single species. Under the microscope, she identified multiple types, mostly goose down with a scattering of chicken and duck. The blend ratio, the curvature of the barbules, the degree of wear, it all pointed to commercial pillow filling. The breakthrough came when detectives sent her a second package. The suspect's winter coat, seized during a search warrant. The coat was high quality, filled with a blend of down and small feathers. When Roxie analyzed its filling, the goose-to-duck ratio was nearly identical to that from the crime scene, but with one striking difference. The coat's fill contained fine, short chicken feathers mixed in, the same uncommon combination found in the crime scene samples. To Roxie, this meant one thing. The coat could have been the source of the feathers found on and around the victim. In court, the prosecution leaned heavily on her testimony. They presented a narrative in which the suspect, a family friend with a history of volatile behavior, attacked the victim during a confrontation, the coat tearing slightly during the struggle and shedding its down. The defense was ready. They argued that down-filled coats were common, that pillows in the guest house could easily have shed feathers during the altercation, and that no one could definitively tie the suspect's coat to the feathers at the scene. They painted Roxie's science as interesting, but inconclusive. Roxie met the challenge calmly. She walked the jury through the microstructures of the feathers, showing how the chicken component, uncommon in most high-end coats, matched both the suspect's garment and the scene. She didn't claim certainty. She claimed consistency. And in forensic science, consistency under the microscope mattered. After days of deliberation, the jury convicted on second-degree murder. The verdict was met with a frenzy of press coverage, some of it praising the ingenuity of using feather evidence, some of it questioning whether such science belonged in court. For Roxie, the attention was uncomfortable. She wasn't interested in celebrity. What mattered was the work, the painstaking, eye-strain-inducing process of turning the delicate architecture of a feather into something that could speak in the language of justice. But the case had an unintended consequence. It made her name widely known among criminal investigators across the country. Soon, more homicide cases and even some cold cases were being routed to her Smithsonian workbench. And one of those cold cases, unsolved for more than a decade, would challenge her as no case had before. It involved a murder weapon long since destroyed, no witnesses, and only a tiny envelope of brittle, yellowing feathers left as evidence. The package that landed on Roxie's desk was unremarkable in size but heavy with history. Inside was a plain manila evidence envelope, its corners worn soft from decades in storage. Across the front, in faded block letters, was a date from the early 1960s, more than 10 years before. The detective who had sent it was from a small city police department in the Midwest. His letter explained the case. A woman had been murdered in her apartment in the spring of 1962. She had been smothered in her bed, her body found by a neighbor who came to check on her after she failed to appear for work. The original investigation had yielded few leads. The only physical clue that stood out was the pillow, ripped at one seam, its contents spilling onto the sheets and carpet. Crime scene techs back then had collected some of the feathers, sealing them in an envelope. But feather evidence wasn't something police knew what to do with in the 60s. It was bagged, labeled, and filed away. Now, more than a decade later, a new detective on the cold case team had heard about the feather woman at the Smithsonian and wondered if the long-forgotten envelope might hold answers. When Roxie opened it, she found the feathers brittle with age, their edges frayed from years in storage. Some were discolored, a faint yellowing that came from time and exposure to trace oils left by human hands. They had a faint musty smell, the scent of old paper and dust. She began with the basics. Under the microscope, even aged and damaged, the barbules still carried their identifying patterns. She saw the smooth contour of goose down, the looser branching of duck feathers, and a small percentage of chicken feathers mixed in, a commercial blend consistent with mid-century pillow manufacturing. That in itself wasn't remarkable. But the detective had also sent clothing from their only surviving suspect, a man who had lived in the victim's building at the time and had been seen near her apartment the night she was killed. He had never been charged, and the case had gone cold. The clothing had been preserved, though not perfectly. Roxie examined the cuffs and seams, looking for any trace of feather material. After hours of meticulous inspection, she found them 3 tiny, pale fragments lodged deep in a seam, invisible to the naked eye. Under magnification, they told a story. The same species mix, the same microstructural patterns, even the same degree of wear as the pillow feathers from the crime scene. When she reported her findings to the detective, she was careful, as always. She could not say definitively that the feathers came from the crime scene pillow, but she could say they were consistent with it, and that finding them embedded in the suspect's clothing was consistent with close contact during or immediately after the incident. The detective took her report to the prosecutor's office. They decided to reopen the case. In court, Roxie's testimony became the bridge between the evidence of the past and the possibility of justice in the present. The defense attacked the age of the samples, arguing that degradation over the years made them unreliable. Roxie explained that while the feathers were old, their microscopic structure was still intact, and that the unique blend of species was rare enough to carry evidentiary weight. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 days. When the verdict came, guilty of manslaughter, the victim's surviving relatives wept openly in the gallery. It was not the maximum charge, but it was something they had thought they would never see: accountability. For Roxie, it was proof that even the most fragile evidence, if preserved and examined with care, could reach across decades. But the case also raised an uncomfortable question for her. How many other unsolved murders had feather evidence sitting in dusty envelopes, overlooked because no one thought to look under a microscope? She didn't have long to dwell on it. Her next case would take her far from the cold rooms of the Smithsonian into the damp, unpredictable chaos of a fresh crime scene. One where feathers would be found not just on the victim, but scattered in the open air, exposed to the elements. The phone call came before sunrise. Roxie, still in her robe, cradled the receiver against her shoulder as a state police investigator from the Pacific Northwest laid out the situation. A body had been discovered in a clearing near the edge of a dense cedar forest. The victim, a young man in his 20s, had been missing for 3 days. His cause of death wasn't immediately obvious. There were signs of blunt force trauma, but no weapon had been recovered. What made the case unusual was what the search team had found around him. Scattered white wisps tangled in wet grass, clinging to brambles, even floating in small puddles left by recent rain. The scene had been exposed to wind, mist, and curious wildlife for at least 48 hours. The lead crime scene tech knew feathers could degrade quickly outdoors, especially in wet conditions. Still, they gathered what they could, carefully placing each fragment in paper evidence envelopes, then rushing them to the lab to dry before mold could set in. From there, the samples were shipped across the country to Roxie. When she opened the package, she immediately saw the challenges. The feathers were waterlogged, their barbules matted together. Dirt and plant matter were embedded deep in the filaments. Some were broken into pieces barely larger than a grain of sand. The first step was restoration. Using fine tweezers, she teased apart the clumps under a low-power scope, gently removing debris without damaging the structures. Then, under her high-powered microscope, the details emerged. The majority were goose-down, white, with smooth, unpigmented barbules. But there was also a notable presence of short, stiff contour feathers from a different bird: pheasant. The mix was unusual. Goose-down was common in coats and bedding, but pheasant feathers were typically used in decorative items, not insulation. That detail became the turning point. The investigators canvassed local shops and found that only one store in the county sold a product with that exact feather combination: a custom hunting jacket, insulated with goose down for warmth but lined with decorative pheasant plumage along the inside seams. When detectives tracked down the jacket, it was in the possession of a man already on their radar, a hunting partner of the victim who had given conflicting statements about the last time he'd seen him. The jacket had a tear along one sleeve, its lining exposed. Under the microscope, the jacket's insulation was a perfect match to the feather mix from the scene. The prosecution built their case around that connection, arguing that the tear had occurred during the fatal confrontation and that the scattered feathers marked the spot where the assault had happened. In court, the defense argued that the jacket owner often hunted in that area and that the feathers could have been shed on a previous trip. Roxie acknowledged the possibility but pointed out the fresh condition of the pheasant contour feathers. Their edges still sharp, their coloration bright, consistent with recent loss rather than long-term exposure. The jury convicted on second-degree murder. For Roxie, the case was satisfying not only because justice had been served, but because it underscored something she'd been telling investigators for years. Feather evidence could survive in the field, even in harsh conditions, if collected and preserved quickly. But the victory came with a sobering realization. More and more, she was being asked to analyze evidence from active homicide investigations, not just cold cases or wildlife crimes. Each one was more public, more scrutinized, and more politically charged than the last. The next file to land on her desk would be her biggest yet. A case where the feather evidence wouldn't just link a suspect to a scene, but to an entire chain of crimes stretching across multiple states. The case began as a robbery in one state and ended as a manhunt spanning 3. At first, it was just another police bulletin, a jewelry store break-in in a mid-sized city in the southeast. But within weeks, similar crimes occurred hundreds of miles apart, each with the same signature. Smashed display cases, fast getaways, and a suspect caught on grainy surveillance wearing a distinctive parka. When the violence escalated, a store clerk shot during one of the robberies, the FBI stepped in. They believed the same man was responsible for all the incidents. The break investigators needed came not from fingerprints or shell casings, but from something found in the getaway car abandoned after the shooting. Tiny feather fragments scattered across the back seat. The Bureau's evidence technicians, remembering previous homicide cases, made the call to the Smithsonian. When the package arrived, Roxie found herself staring at one of the most diverse mixes of feather material she had ever seen from a single source. There was white goose down, gray duck down, and, most unusually, several small contour feathers with iridescent green sheens, the kind seen in male mallards. She recognized this combination instantly. It matched a rare, custom-insulated garment line produced by a single outdoor gear manufacturer. The jacket, part hunting coat, part cold-weather parka, was filled with a blend of goose, duck, and decorative mallard contour feathers, the latter used purely as a marketing flourish. Only a few hundred had ever been sold, mostly in the Midwest. The FBI tracked sales records and found that one of these parkas had been purchased 2 years earlier by the prime suspect's girlfriend. When agents executed a search warrant at her apartment, they found the jacket, its lining torn, the same feather blend spilling from the seams. This is where the case got tricky. Because the crimes had occurred in multiple states, each jurisdiction had its own evidence protocols. Some feathers had been collected in paper envelopes, others in plastic bags, a few even wrapped in adhesive tape. The potential for contamination was high. Roxie insisted on re-examining all the samples together, documenting the condition of each and noting signs of improper storage. Despite the differences in handling, the microstructures of the feathers, barbule node spacing, curvature, pigmentation, were consistent across all samples, including those from the jacket. In court, the defense mounted an aggressive challenge, attacking both the chain of custody and the novelty of feather forensics. They argued that feathers were too common to be meaningful evidence and that any similarities were coincidence. Roxie countered by walking the jury through each species in the blend, explaining how the decorative mallard contour feathers were uncommon in commercial insulation and how their presence in both the crime scene samples and the suspect's jacket was statistically unusual. She explained the risks of contamination, but also why, in this case, the consistency of microscopic features outweighed those concerns. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The conviction cleared not just the murder case, but linked the suspect to the entire chain of robberies. The FBI thanked her privately, noting that without the feather analysis, they might never have tied all the crimes together. For Roxie, the case was another reminder that her field, once dismissed as a curiosity, was now being relied upon in some of the most complex, multi-jurisdictional cases in the country. But with that reliance came higher stakes and sharper scrutiny. Her next challenge would push both to the limit, a homicide where the feather evidence was so minuscule, so damaged, that even Roxie wondered if it could speak at all. The courier delivered the evidence in a plain cardboard box, smaller than a shoebox but marked with a bright red sticker. Fragile, biological evidence. Inside were 2 envelopes and a note from the homicide detective that read simply, "This is all we have. Victim was found in an abandoned cabin. No weapon. No usable fingerprints. If the feathers can't tell us something, this case is dead." When Roxie opened the first envelope, she found less than a teaspoon of material, barely enough to cover the palm of her hand. Most of it was dust, splinters of wood, and tiny insect parts. Only under a jeweler's loupe could she pick out a few possible feather fragments, each no bigger than the head of a pin. The second envelope was worse. The contents had clearly been wet at some point, perhaps from rain seeping through the cabin roof, and then dried into a flattened clump. Mold spores dotted the surface like tiny black freckles. Many forensic analysts would have considered the samples beyond salvaging. But Roxie had a method for this kind of case, developed through years of working with degraded museum specimens. She began by isolating each possible feather fragment, soaking it in a gentle cleaning solution, and then carefully teasing the barbules apart with fine-tipped probes under a low-power microscope. It was painstaking work. Hours passed with little more to show than a handful of fragile, translucent filaments. But gradually structure emerged. Unpigmented goose down with smooth, unnotched barbules, and more interestingly, a single, intact contour feather with reddish-brown pigmentation and dark barring along the vein. That contour feather didn't match any commercial insulation she knew. Instead, it belonged to a bird species not commonly used in manufactured products, the red-tailed hawk. The discovery puzzled her. Hawks weren't domestic birds, and their feathers were protected under federal law. Possession without a permit was illegal. Why would a red-tailed hawk feather be at the scene of a homicide? The answer came when the detective sent her photographs from the suspect's home. Hanging on the wall, in plain view, was a ceremonial headdress made of various bird feathers, including several from red-tailed hawks. The detective believed it had been worn during the killing. The victim's wounds suggested a close, face-to-face struggle, and the feather could have been dislodged during that violent contact. In court, Roxie explained how she had recovered and identified the fragments, emphasizing that the red-tailed hawk feather was both distinctive and rare in ordinary environments. She stopped short of saying it proved the headdress had been at the crime scene, but the implication was clear. The defense tried to argue contamination, that the feather could have been tracked in years earlier or even planted. But the condition of the feather told another story. Its clean edges and lack of weathering suggested it had been lost recently, not long ago. The jury returned a guilty verdict for second-degree murder. The feather, a single fragile scrap, had been a decisive part of the case. Afterward, Roxie reflected on how close this one had come to being unworkable. It reminded her that in feather forensics, the difference between success and failure could hinge on a fragment no bigger than a grain of rice. The lesson would prove vital in her next investigation, one where she wouldn't just be looking for microscopic clues in a lab, but out in the field, combing through a crime scene before the evidence had any chance to disappear. It was unusual for Roxie to leave the controlled environment of her Smithsonian lab, but this time, she didn't have a choice. The sheriff's department in a remote corner of the Appalachians was working a homicide where the scene itself was the challenge. A rocky riverbank, open to the wind and weather, with fresh rain threat. The victim was a middle-aged man found sprawled on the stones at the water's edge. Blunt force trauma to the head was the likely cause of death, but there was no weapon in sight. The suspect list was short. The victim had been in a heated property dispute with a neighbor, but evidence was thin. The lead investigator had seen feather forensics work in court before, and when a deputy spotted small wisps caught in the thorny underbrush nearby, the sheriff called Roxie directly. She arrived 2 days later, stepping out of the county's only patrol SUV into the damp, earthy smell of river mud. Her first impression was how exposed the scene was. No roof, no walls, just rocks, water, and trees that swayed in the wind like restless sentinels. She got to work immediately, Wearing gloves and kneeling low, she used fine-tipped forceps to pluck each visible wisp from leaves, branches, and the victim's clothing. She worked in silence, blocking out the chatter of deputies. For each piece, she used separate paper evidence folds, labeling them with location, time, and weather conditions. She knew how easy it was for a careless collection to contaminate or destroy feather evidence. The largest find came from the underside of a jagged rock not far from the body, a clump of down, still slightly damp but sheltered from direct rain. Nearby, she found several contour feathers wedged between river stones, their edges frayed as if from a violent pull. Back at the sheriff's evidence room, she set up a temporary workstation. Under a portable microscope, she began the preliminary sort. The down was white goose, common in cold weather clothing. The contour feathers were different, mottled brown and black, the pattern unmistakable. Wild turkey. The combination was odd. Goose down was often used in jackets and sleeping bags, but wild turkey feathers weren't standard in manufactured items. They were more often seen in handcrafted gear, particularly hunting attire or decorative garments. The sheriff's deputies seized on that detail. The suspect they'd had their eye on was known for making his own hunting jackets, stitching turkey feathers into the shoulders as a personal signature. When they brought the jacket in, Roxie confirmed the match. The turkey feathers from the jacket had the same pigmentation and wear as those from the scene. The goose down, she found, came from the quilted lining, ripped at one seam with filling spilling out in tufts. In court, she explained the rarity of the turkey feather pattern and how the combination of both species in the same evidence set narrowed the possible sources significantly. The defense claimed the feathers could have been shed during a hunting trip days earlier, but Roxie pointed to the damp condition and fresh edges of the barbules, consistent with recent loss. The jury convicted on manslaughter. It wasn't the maximum charge, but the sheriff later told her the verdict wouldn't have been possible without her fieldwork. For Roxie, the experience reinforced something she'd long believed. The earlier she could get to a scene, the better the evidence would be. Too often, she worked with samples that had already been mishandled or degraded. Out here, she could control every step. She didn't know it yet, but that lesson would be put to the test almost immediately. In a case where she would arrive just hours after a killing, with the crime scene still warm and the perpetrator possibly close enough to be watching. The call came while Roxie was still unpacking her gear from the riverbank case. A U.S. Fish and Wildlife agent she knew well didn't bother with pleasantries. "Roxie, we've got a homicide in the Marshlands down here. Victims fresh, hours old. Local deputies think the killer's still nearby. We need you here now." The Marshlands were a different world. Flat, open, and treacherous underfoot. Roxie flew in that night and was met by a deputy in an unmarked truck. They drove in silence down a narrow dirt track until the headlights picked up the crime scene tape strung between two cypress trees. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin. Insects hummed, and somewhere out in the dark, a heron called. The victim, a man in his 40s, lay half-submerged in the shallows. He'd been struck in the head and dragged into the water, possibly to hide the body. The deputies had already secured a perimeter, but the scene was far from stable. Tides shifted here, and even the smallest wave could carry away the delicate evidence she needed. Roxie knelt in the mud, her flashlight beam sweeping slowly over the body. That's when she saw them. Faint wisps tangled in the man's shirt collar, and another set caught on a splintered root nearby. Under her magnifier, the fibers weren't plant matter. They were feathers, damp but intact. The contour feathers were gray with subtle banding, the kind she associated with marshland birds, specifically clapper rails. Mixed in were clusters of white goose down, clearly from a manufactured product. The dual source told her two things. The rail feathers likely came from the environment, perhaps disturbed during the struggle, while the goose down was foreign, likely from the assailant's clothing. That meant she could separate what was part of the scene naturally from what the killer had brought in. She marked and bagged each sample, making sure to note which came from the victim's body and which from the surrounding terrain. The deputies fanned out, searching for anything else that could tie the two together. An hour later, one of them returned with a sodden jacket they'd found snagged in the reeds about 30 yards away. The lining had split open, leaking goose down identical to what she'd collected. In the outer seam, she found a single rail feather, matching the species from the crime scene. To Roxie, it was like watching two puzzle pieces click into place. Whoever had worn the jacket had been in direct contact with both the victim and the marsh's native birdlife. The danger wasn't just theoretical. Halfway through her work, a radio crackled with the news that someone had been spotted moving through the tree line. Deputies fanned out, weapons drawn, and moments later, they returned with a man in handcuffs. Wet from the knees down, mud streaked up his sleeves. At the station, the suspect's story fell apart almost immediately. When confronted with Roxie's preliminary findings, the jacket, the feather match, the environmental consistency, he went silent. In court weeks later, she testified that the feather combination was unique to that scene and that jacket. The jury took less than a day to convict on first-degree murder. For Roxie, the case was a reminder that feather forensics didn't just work in clean, distant labs. Sometimes it worked best in the mess of real life. Knee-deep in mud, the air thick with heat, and the clock ticking before the evidence was gone forever. But the next case would strip away even those advantages. No fresh scene, no visible feathers, just an object, a potential murder weapon, that might or might not carry the faintest trace of avian evidence. The package arrived without ceremony, no urgent courier, no flashing crime scene tape. Just a plain cardboard box from a state evidence locker, addressed to Roxie with a short note. Possible murder weapon. Handle carefully. Suspect denies connection. See if you can find anything. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of brown paper, was an old wooden walking stick. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Worn smooth in places from years of use, the tip capped with tarnished brass. But there was something about its heft, the faint discoloration along one side, that hinted it had been involved in more than leisurely strolls. The case file told the story. A man had been found dead in his rural cabin, his skull fractured by a single blow. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. The walking stick had been seized from a neighbor during a search warrant, but without direct evidence tying it to the crime, prosecutors had nothing solid. Roxie began with the usual visual inspection under bright light. The brass tip showed traces of dirt and plant matter, but that wasn't unusual for a walking stick. The wood itself, however, had a faint patch of fibrous material caught in a shallow groove just below the handle. It was so small she almost missed it. Under the microscope, the fibers resolved into something unmistakable. Tiny interlocking barbules, the hallmark of a feather. They were pale gray, with a faint iridescence under angled light, and curved in a way that suggested contour feathers from a medium-sized bird. The size and structure led her to narrow it down. Pigeon. Urban or rural, pigeons were everywhere, but their feathers rarely ended up embedded in an object like this unless there had been direct, forceful contact. Digging deeper, Roxie found faint smears along the same groove, degraded but consistent with dried blood. When combined with the feather fragment, the picture grew clearer. The stick had struck something or someone, with enough force to dislodge a pigeon feather and drive it into the wood's fibers. The connection seemed odd until the detective explained that the victim kept carrier pigeons in a loft attached to the cabin. If he had been holding or near one when attacked, the blow could easily have trapped a feather in the weapon. The prosecution seized on this. The defense tried to argue that the feather could have been picked up at any time, on a walk near the victim's property, for example. But Roxie countered with the condition of the feather. Its edges were frayed in a way consistent with violent impact, not natural shedding, and the blood traces were co-located in the same groove. The jury convicted the neighbor of second-degree murder. For Roxie, it was another lesson in the value of microtraces. Evidence so small and easy to overlook that it could have been wiped away with one careless cleaning. Her reputation by now was unshakable among investigators, and that reputation would soon pull her into one of the most sensitive cases of her career. A killing in which the prime suspect wasn't a stranger or rival, but a close family member of the victim, and the feather evidence risked tearing that family apart forever. It was late autumn when the case file landed on Roxie's desk, but the photographs inside carried the warmth of a summer afternoon. Sunlight spilling across a farmhouse porch, wildflowers climbing the fence. That warmth, however, was only in the pictures. The reality was grim. A 62-year-old woman found dead in her bedroom, the victim of blunt force trauma. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen. The sheriff's report was blunt. Likely an inside job. The suspect list was short. Her adult son, who lived in the guest house on the property, and her younger sister, who was staying for the week. Both swore they had been asleep. What drew Roxie into the case was a single photograph buried in the back of the file, a close-up of the victim's quilt. Along one seam, there were small tufts of down, as if the fabric had been torn in the struggle. The local lab had collected the material, but without the ability to analyze it microscopically, they'd sent it to her. When Roxie opened the evidence envelope, she recognized the down immediately, white goose, clean and uniform. But mixed in with the down were half a dozen small contour feathers with a warm, mottled brown pattern. She knew the type: pheasant, likely from a decorative pillow or throw. It didn't take long for the sheriff to confirm. The younger sister had brought a pheasant feather throw from her home as a gift for the victim. It had been draped over a chair in the bedroom. But here was the twist. During a second search of the son's guest house, deputies found several pheasant contour feathers caught in the cuff seam of one of his flannel shirts. They were nearly identical to the ones from the victim's quilt. Roxie went to work on a side-by-side comparison. Under the microscope, she matched the microstructure, the pigmentation, the arrangement of barbules with near-perfect consistency. Still, she was careful in her conclusions. "These feathers are consistent with those from the victim's bedroom," she wrote. "Their location on the suspect's clothing suggests possible contact with the scene." She could not say it proved guilt. In court, the defense hammered her caution. They argued that the son could have picked up the feathers at any time, by sitting on the chair with the throw, for example. Roxie didn't deny it, but she added that the combination of pheasant contour feathers and goose down found together suggested a moment when the throw and quilt were disturbed simultaneously, something more likely in a violent struggle than casual contact. The jury wrestled with the evidence for days before convicting the son of voluntary manslaughter. It was one of the few times Roxie felt the weight of her testimony long after the trial ended. The family had fractured completely. The younger sister left the state, and the property was sold within months. For all the satisfaction of solving a case, this one left her uneasy. She had always believed her role was to let the evidence speak. But in this case, the evidence had spoken with just enough clarity to destroy a family. She didn't know it yet, but her next case would carry a different kind of weight. Not the destruction of a family, but the possibility of clearing an innocent person after years of wrongful suspicion, all because of one overlooked feather. The request came not from a police department, but from a defense attorney. That alone made Roxie pause. Most of her calls came from prosecutors or investigators. But this lawyer's tone was urgent. "My client's been under suspicion for 12 years. He's lost jobs, his marriage, everything. We believe you can prove he didn't do it." The case file was thick with a decade of accusations. The victim, a young woman, had been found in a wooded clearing after a late-night gathering with friends. She'd been strangled, and her body left under a blanket. The only physical clue tying anyone to the scene was a cluster of white feathers found on the blanket and on the suspect's jacket. Back then, the state lab had identified them broadly as goose or duck feathers, consistent with the blanket's filling. The prosecution had argued that the match was proof the suspect had wrapped the victim himself. There wasn't enough to convict, but it was enough to stain his life with suspicion. Now, years later, the defense wanted a second opinion. When the evidence arrived, Roxie started with the original blanket. She carefully removed a small sample of the pure goose down, clean and uniform. Then she turned to the old evidence bags containing the crime scene feathers and the suspect's jacket. Under the microscope, the difference was immediate. The feathers from the jacket were not goose down at all. They were a blend of down and small contour feathers with a slight tan pigmentation, more consistent with eider duck, a species rarely used in mass-produced blankets but common in certain high-end winter coats. The kicker? The suspect's jacket, still in evidence, was insulated with that exact eider blend. The presence of those feathers on the blanket made perfect sense if the suspect had been near it socially, perhaps sitting beside it earlier that night, but it also meant the original assumption was wrong. The jacket feathers weren't from the blanket, and the blanket feathers weren't on the jacket. In other words, there was no direct transfer tying the suspect to the act of wrapping the body. Roxie put it plainly in her report. The feather evidence as originally interpreted does not support the conclusion that the suspect handled the blanket containing the victim. In court, she walked the jury through the microscopic differences, showing how the node spacing, pigmentation, and branching patterns ruled out a match. Her testimony reframed the narrative. The jacket feathers proved nothing about the killing, only that the suspect owned warm clothing. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty in less than 3 hours. The man, now in his 40s, broke down in tears at the defense table. Afterward, he approached Roxie quietly. "You didn't just clear me," he said. "You gave me my life back." For her, it was a rare chance to see the other side of forensic work, not just securing convictions but preventing wrongful ones. But the next case would swing the pendulum hard in the other direction. A murder so brutal, and a feather trail so clear, that even Roxie felt a shiver when she realized what it revealed about the killer's movements. It started with a blood-stained trail that vanished too quickly. A woman had been murdered in her own home, a violent attack that left signs of a desperate struggle. Neighbors heard nothing, but a passerby spotted the front door ajar and called the police. When officers entered, they found the victim in the living room. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled open. The window at the back of the house had been shattered from the inside. Outside, muddy footprints led a short distance into the yard before disappearing into the grass. That's where the lead detective noticed something else. Tiny white wisps, barely visible against the damp lawn. He ordered the scene frozen and called Roxie. By the time she arrived, the yard had been cordoned off with tape. The air smelled of rain and wet earth, and a mist hung over the ground like a thin veil. She moved slowly, scanning the grass with her flashlight held low. There they were, small clusters of down caught on blades of grass, on fence wire, even on a low-hanging branch over the back gate. She collected each piece separately, noting its location with care. When she reached the alley behind the property, she found more. A trail that curved between 2 garages and ended abruptly at a discarded jacket half buried under wet leaves. Back at her lab, the pattern emerged. The down was goose, clean and unpigmented, consistent with high-end winter clothing. But mixed in were occasional contour feathers with a narrow black and white barring, unmistakably from guinea fowl. That combination wasn't random. She'd seen it once before, in a luxury parka brand that used goose down for insulation and guinea fowl feathers as decorative trim along the hood. When detectives tracked down sales records, only 3 such parkas had been purchased in the region in the past 2 years. One belonged to the prime suspect, a handyman who had worked at the victim's home a few weeks earlier. Under the microscope, feathers from the parka's trim matched the trail exactly, down to the wear patterns. Even the arrangement of pigment spots was consistent, a sort of avian fingerprint. But what struck Roxie was the sequence of locations where the feathers had been found. They began near the victim's body, moved through the shattered window, across the yard, over the back fence, and into the alley. The path told a story. The killer had fled quickly, snagging the decorative trim on branches and wire, shedding feathers with each movement. In court, Roxie mapped it out for the jury, overlaying feather recovery points on a diagram of the neighborhood. The trail was a silent witness, guiding them step by step through the killer's escape. The defense had little room to maneuver. The parka's distinctive feather blend, combined with the trail leading directly from the crime scene to the suspect's abandoned jacket, was too precise to dismiss. The guilty verdict came swiftly. For Roxie, this case felt different. Most feather evidence required deep analysis to connect the dots. Here, the dots had been scattered across the landscape, waiting for someone to notice them. It was as if the crime had been written in feathers for anyone with the eyes to read it. Her next case, however, would be far more ambiguous. No trail, no clear sequence, Just a single feather at a scene where it didn't belong, and 100 possible explanations for how it got there. The crime scene was a suburban garage, quiet and ordinary at first glance. The victim, a retired schoolteacher, had been found slumped beside her car, the side of her head fractured. There were no signs of forced entry, no stolen valuables, and no witnesses. The police had little to go on until a rookie evidence tech bagged something unusual. A single feather resting on the concrete floor near the victim's body. It was small, barely 2 centimeters long, but it had a deep, glossy black with a faint green sheen when the light hit it just right. When the sample arrived at Roxie's lab, she turned it over in her tweezers, studying the shape and structure under magnification. It was a contour feather, not down, with tight barbule nodes and a subtle curvature. That green-black sheen was a giveaway. It came from a drake mallard. Mallard feathers were not rare in the natural world, especially in areas with ponds or creeks. But this neighborhood was fully paved and landscaped, the nearest wetland nearly 3 miles away. She called the lead detective. "Do any of your suspects have hunting gear or waterfowl mounts?" she asked. He hesitated, then admitted one did, the victim's neighbor, a man she'd recently argued with over a property line. In his garage hung several mounted ducks, including a mallard drake. When the police examined the mount, they found a section where a feather had been cleanly broken from the vein, not shed naturally, but snapped, likely during a struggle or a sudden jolt. The defense argued coincidence. A breeze, an open garage door, and the feather could have drifted in days earlier. Roxie conceded that it was possible, but pointed to the feather's pristine condition. The barbules were still interlocked, free of dust or debris. This was not a feather that had been lying on the floor for long. On cross-examination, she was asked point-blank, "Can you say, without a doubt, that this feather means my client killed the victim?" She didn't flinch. "No, a feather can't convict someone alone, but it can tell you whether to keep looking in a particular direction. And in this case, the direction it points is toward your client." The jury found the neighbor guilty of manslaughter, a verdict shaped as much by circumstantial patterns as by the feather itself. For Roxie, it was a fitting end to another chapter in her career, a reminder that feather forensics was not magic, not an instant key to truth. It was a language of small, delicate clues, one that required patience to interpret and humility to present. Some cases gave her trails, others gave her fragments, and still others gave her only the faintest suggestion of a connection. But in all of them, she found the same quiet satisfaction, letting these silent witnesses, the feathers, tell their part of the story before time and chance could erase them. And somewhere, in the Smithsonian's dimly lit lab,